and Human Geography here. And I'm very pleased to have our distinguished panel here tonight. We'll address the issues surrounding our topic, which is spectacle of violence, from Charlie Hebdo to North Carolina. I'll outline briefly what to expect this evening. First, each panel member will give a 5 to 7 minute opening address, outlining some of the issues and events that have affected the world in the past months. We'll then open for questions from the audience, and I'll explain that procedure a little bit later. Please remember that tonight is for discussion, and we want to have a very civil dialogue and discourse on this topic that we may have very different views on. Please listen and respond appropriately. We're going to look at the future to examine how our community might respond to any event such as Charlie Hebdo would happen. Our first speaker tonight is Roy Franklin. Roy Franklin is the spiritual leader of Har Shalom, Missoula Synagogue. She is also a rabbinic. Rabbinic, all right, yeah. Rabbinic student at LF, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal Ordination Programs, and a faculty affiliate in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at the University of Montana. So a very diverse background.
Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center at UM for setting up this occasion, and also thank you for inviting me. I'd like to talk about identity. Can you hear me well?
No. Perfect.
How's this? All right. So I'd like to talk about identity. Who are we? What meaning and direction does our sense of identity bring to our lives? And how does it affect the way we treat others? As we grow up, we absorb many, many messages about who we are. We get messages from our upbringing, our schooling, popular culture, and our life experience. And each of us fuses all of these aspects of identity into a personal patchwork that becomes us. Also, we're influenced by the sacred texts of our religious traditions. Whether or not we are active practitioners of a particular faith, the great foundational religious texts influence the course and the psycho-spiritual fabric of modern life. So, as Mr. Mark said, I am a rabbi in training. I call it a rabbi with training wheels. And I spend much time learning Jewish sacred texts as part of my studies. So I want to bring to you today an interesting and compelling duality that exists in the Jewish canon. I bring it to you because I think we can all recognize elements in it that shape our understanding of how humans interact in this world. And I'm speaking today of tribalism, sometimes called particularism, and universalism, and how, on one hand, we're encouraged to see ourselves as having unique destinies, and then on the other hand, we are encouraged to see ourselves as part of a greater unified world where our allegiances to any one group are superseded by our desire for good for all humankind. So how do we hold these two different perspectives in tension? How do we make a coherent unity out of them? How do we become either enriched or hobbled by universalism and particularism? And ultimately, how might our approach to these apparently competing values affect our propensity for violent action toward those whom we view as the other? I'm raising big issues here. I won't even partially address them in the scope of this brief presentation, but I am eager to provoke us to continue to reflect on them as we listen to each other this evening, because elements of these ideas will underlie and weave through all that we hear tonight. So, let's go to text. Let's consider a few texts from the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to bring to you Genesis chapter 1, parts of verses 26 and 27. I'm reading in translation. God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness." And further, God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, they were created. So let's first jump over a couple of issues here. We're not discussing whether this is consistent with scientific knowledge, and we're also not going to explore today what it means to be created in God's image, because that's a huge topic in itself. But I am going to assert that these verses tell us that from the get-go, all humans are precious and have a relationship with the source of all, because we are created as a mirror, a reflection of that holiness. This applies to everyone, no exceptions. So this text comes to teach that human value is universal. And in two brief verses, we hear a version of the words B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image, 3 times. And the Torah, when it's hand-scribed in a scroll, there are no capitals, there's no underlining, there's no color, there's no italics. When something is repeated several times in 2 verses, you know that's a clue that this is really important to pay attention to. Now let's hear a text that celebrates tribalism or particularism. I'm going to read to you translations of Exodus 19:4 and 6. And in this, God is talking to Moses, telling him what to say. "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the people of Israel." So these words appear following very hard on the story of the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. And this text comes to teach that the Israelites are to remember and acknowledge that they received special salvation from slavery in Egypt, and moreover that they have status as treasured kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Very elevated words, very elevated status. So how can we connect these two texts? If we are all created as reflections of the divine, then does any single person deserve, or any single people deserve special treatment? And how do we reconcile universal specialness with particular specialness? Does being part of a particular group make us feel happier, safer, more superior? Do we look down on those outside the group and feel self-congratulatory for being special? Do we keep ourselves apart from others and miss out on adventurous interactions if we only stay with our own kind? On the other hand, if we value universality over particular features of our ethnic, religious, cultural, and political differences, do we run the risk of promoting the erasure of rich traditions, of languages, of ways of viewing the world? Do we race towards a world, a melting pot of beige? Is it possible, as children of the great mystery, that we are all beloved, and each of the world's peoples, and each individual in their own way, that the specialness of one does not override the specialness of any other? No favoritism here, just the specialness all around. All having unique qualities, stories, histories, and jobs to do. Let's learn more about each other. Let's break down barriers to sharing our deeply held beliefs. Let's learn more about what might lead to the practice of demonizing others on a personal and a societal level, and think about how violence can follow on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lori. Next, we'll hear tonight from John Watt. John is a ELCA Lutheran pastor, and he's director of the Advanced Campus Ministry at the University of Montana. John.
I'd also like to thank Hellgate High School for hosting, John and others, and all of you for being here, and for the opportunity to be on this panel. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So throughout history, there are always factions who are looking at life through the lens of fear and self-preservation and finding ways to perpetuate into hatred and violence. How do we respond? How are we peacemakers in that world? I'd like to draw a little bit on a story from my own faith perspective as a Christian. When we think of the teachings and stories of Jesus, we might think of some of the miracles like water into wine, healing the blind man, the feeding of the 5,000. There's another miracle that often gets overlooked, which I think, though, is much more profound. It starts with that feeding of the 5,000, which in itself is an amazing story. If you think about the fact that 5,000 probably there wasn't like somebody counting. It was more the number that represented all. But it was all of us. Jesus and his followers were Jewish. The writer of the book of Mark, where the story first comes, was Jewish. 5,000 for Mark represented all of our people. It's profound to say that there's enough for everybody. No matter what, everybody gets fed. But there's more to the story. See, at that time, there was also a lot of fear. There was a lot of hatred. There were calls for violent overthrow. They thought maybe Jesus would be the one for revolution. But instead, he says to his followers, after that first feeding, let's hop in the boat and go across to the other side. And the problem with the other side is that the people over there had a different skin and a different language and a different belief and different food practices. They were the ones that they were afraid of and hated and would have rather hit them in the head with a stick than invite them over for dinner. Let's go across to the other side. And then the great storm comes up, and it pounds the boat, and they're almost sinking. Some have said, well, these are just the storms of life. But this story is more about the fear of the other, the terror inside. And Jesus is asleep. They wake him up and they say, don't you even care? We're about to perish. And you can read in this story the intensity of that fear. Going across to them feels like we're about to perish. It's that fear of the other that is still in our world today. It's the fear that was in parts of my family who lived in the suburbs of Detroit around African Americans. And at family reunions would talk about which neighborhoods the blacks were moving into and how bad it was. It's the fear that others in my family had of native peoples in Upper Michigan. And were afraid to go into Indian country or on the reservation. It's the fear that friends in high school, the guys, had of anyone perceived to be gay. The same fear that I internalized in different ways and had to come to terms with. And Jesus is awoken and stands up in that boat and he says, peace be still, and the storm is calmed. And he calls them to have faith. And they go across to the other side. And there they build relationships and friendships, and they heal people that need help. And then there's another feeding story, but this time it's 4,000. I always thought maybe it was just a smaller crowd. But 4,000 was the number that meant all of them. All of them as well. The ones we're afraid of, the ones we are hating, all of them are fed as well. And you think about in a culture that a meal has to do with honor and respect, to sit down and have a meal with all of them means that healing had to happen. Stories and tears and laughter. It's in the crossing over that hearts and minds are softened, relationships are built. Our call is to cross over. What does that mean for us today? What needs to be broken down? Thank you.
Next we have Samir Qatar. He's a lecturer of Arabic language and culture at the University of Montana. He is a native Palestinian. Qatar has been teaching Arabic at the University of Montana since 1999.
السلام عليكم أيها السيدات والسادة. Shalom, حبايبي حبايبات. Peace be upon you, ladies and gentlemen. What we just heard is the Muslim greeting, which symbolizes actions of the Islamic faith. It is my pleasure and honor to be with you here this evening. I would like to thank John Marks for being with us this evening. I would like to thank the Jeannette Rankin Peace Center, the Center for Central and Southwest Asian Studies. I would like to thank Hellgate High School. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank my family, especially my wife, for all the love and support over the years. Most of all, I would like to thank all of you for being here with us this evening. Thank you. Interest in Islam and the Arab world, its history, cultures, and languages has heightened in the U.S. given the current world affairs and its geopolitical currents. Coupled with all the events, namely September 11 and all the following wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, As Americans, our diversity is one of our nation's strengths. We need to develop linguistic skills that will enable us to explore and understand the history, culture, political and economic realities of our current world. We currently have many unresolved political disputes all over the world. All these disputes involve Muslims, who constitute the majority of the victims in all of these conflicts. Many of the victims are subjects of UN resolutions that still remain unresolved. The Palestinians are amongst these victims who are struggling to free themselves from an occupier who refuses to comply with UN resolutions. Many Muslim societies suffer negative social and economic factors aggravated by the advent of colonialism, overpopulation, industrialization, and modernization, resulting in cultural dislocation and so many other elements. Some members from these societies have reached a level where they feel they no longer can affect their own future, and yet again become victims, this time to fundamentalist ideology. Many groups advocating Islam as a political movement are invariably responding to complex political and historical situations, usually with deep roots in the local environment. The members of such groups are more likely to see themselves as freedom fighters rather than terrorists. Historically, Islamism has been described as a reaction to colonialism, or alternatively, an effect of post-colonialism. Some Western countries consider theocratic philosophies a threat to their status as secular nation states and have taken proactive approaches to contain and/or counteract various Islamist movements. Their application of the Islamic militancy, militant Islam, is so broad that it encompasses any kind of revolutionary movement in any Muslim majority country. To blame the religion of Islam is a great misconception. In Islam, force can only be used with the aim of establishing equilibrium and harmony, and not for personal or sectarian reasons, identified with the interests of a person or a particular group and not the whole. Since the ideologies that have dominated the Middle East have not worked, we are seeing a growing trend in militant Islam, with groups that use religion as a political organizational tool. These various groups, with their relevant political agenda, justify their actions using the rhetoric of Islam, thus providing the world with a perversion of Islam, not a reflection of Islam. Their fundamentalist interpretations of the Quranic verses is highly flawed. These extremists are distorting the Muslim faith indeed, thus violating its principles of peace. You know, religion is not the enemy. We have many major burning issues around the world that need to be addressed urgently. We need to go to the root causes of these conflicts, give the people their rights, self-respect, and honor, thus depriving these extremist groups of their motivation and support. There are some basic principles about reading and understanding Scripture. After all, studying the Quran is not exactly like reading a novel. Like any other scripture, there are rules that may be followed. As the verses are connected to each other, the reader should study at least the preceding and following verses for a sense of the immediate context. Also, the reader should look at all of the verses that deal with the same object. The extremists are not only violating the principles of Islam, they are violating the principles I outlined about the reading the Quran, scriptures, and thus continually quoted out of context. Muslim scholars are of the opinion that war is permitted in self-defense when other nations have attacked the Islamic State. The Islamic sacred texts not only include exhortation to fight, they also lay out detailed rules of engagement. Experts say the extremists broke every rule in the Quran. The tradition explicitly prohibits the killing of non-combatants, women, children, the aged, even a tree. It forbids suicide. It even requires prior notice to attack. As Americans, we need to exercise the freedom to build a just society. Justice is the great work of human beings on earth. Kindly wage peace to preserve values of the spirit for future generations. Get informed. With the wealth of information available at our fingertips, we can read and view a variety of news, resources, and studies which will help us develop a more rounded perspectives. I urge you all to speak your mind with motivation, purpose, and direction. But most of all, exercise your critical thinking. Find the courage to think outside the box and join me in imagining global harmony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samir. Next we have Gigi Weiss. She is a professor of anthropology at the university, and she is an official survivor as chaperone of the Hellgate band trip to New York.
So I want to thank everyone for coming here, because the reason we're here is because you are here. And you are the unofficial speakers that we will soon be inviting to have a dialogue about these issues. I want to turn from the discussions we've just had of the world faiths and the remarkable work my colleagues have done to reclaim them as ethical traditions for the purposes of tonight, to draw from that wisdom a way of thinking about how we respond to everyday events when they are reported to us in the news from far away, and especially the kind of shocking events that catalyzed us to think about organizing this event. As Mr. Marks said, I was just recently in New York with the Hellgate Wind Ensemble and the chaperone parents, and it struck me the whole time we were there what an amazing journey we were having together, even though some of us were marked as chaperones, and presumably we knew more, could somehow secure the safety of the minors on the trip, but it became very clear to me very early that we were all taking care of each other. And the students were doing as much to secure the safety and the harmony of the trip as the adults as chaperones. And it gave me an enormous sense of peace as we moved through airports in New York City to watch Hellgate community and the musicians, the students, the instructors, and the parents all negotiate a world that, for some people was very new and difficult. New York City, if you've ever been there, it's quite a challenge. And I think people really rose to the occasion as I watched them sort of encounter difference. So for our purposes of tonight, I would just like to talk about the three kinds of violence that our next speakers will address in particular. The first kind of violence we saw with the Charlie Hebdo massacre. And I think Professor Michelle Valentine is going to have an amazing analysis of the kind of alienation and really difficult psychosocial sort of analysis one needs to be able to understand the position of people who murder in that sort of dramatic and really incomprehensible way to us. But the second kind of violence was much closer to home. It was in North Carolina. And it was the event that prompted me to call my friends and colleagues and say, we really have to respond. We can't let these events just be reported to us in the news and not think about how we can both prevent them from happening in the future in the communities we live in, but also respond to them in a way that honors the people who we've lost and also tries to, again, address how do we keep our world secure and honor each other. And the third kind of violence that strikes me every day, particularly working in education, is the difficulty of inviting people to have events in which we can have dialogue and maybe dissent, maybe ideas that are uncomfortable and new to us, but also kind of opening out of learning the way we can from these traditions, as our colleagues have just shown us. Because this is really what democracy looks like, is an open dialogue and a way in which the fascism, the kind of authoritarianism that is in the world today that has caused so many of the conflicts that Samir was alluding to, that provide sort of incomprehensible violences elsewhere, there are signs of that kind of authoritarianism in each community, in our communities too. And I think we need to be sensitive to how we can every day undo those violences, mend them, find a way of preventing them. And I'm talking about the kind of violences that happen when it seems like a kind of micro-violence, just when people don't feel they can speak, when they feel that, it's too hard to go out tonight. It's too much to try to cope with these things. I just feel tired. I worked all day. And we all feel that. But we all came out tonight
because we know that there's something more. There's something more in this community that can find more positive and, I hope, more promising ways of living than to have to face the kind of news we saw. So, in closing, I just want to say what a remarkable experience it was to work and live for over 8 days with high school students, and it reminded me why I teach at the university. I teach ethics right now, and I have the pleasure twice a week of being with students to try to think out loud about ethics and how we can lead more ethical lives. And I learned quite a bit from the students, and I continue to. I hope from your questions in a few minutes that I will learn more.
Thank you very much, DP. Our next presenter is Professor Michel Valentin. He teaches French at all levels at the University of Montana and specializes in critical textual theory, especially of Lacanian psychoanalytical obedience. So I'd like to introduce to you Professor Valentin.
White rage. I hate blacks. I hate Jews. I hate Arabs and Muslims. I hate Indians. I hate Chicanos. I hate homeless, beggars, and poor. I hate fags. I hate whores. I hate the French. They smell, they are arrogant and unfriendly. La putain de race. I hate myself. I unconsciously hate this part which is in me more than myself, more than me, whatever I do. This life which is torturing me like an excess that I can't control. What am I going to do with it? To make things worse, it makes me feel like shit, like I am a nothing. Why do I suffer so? What do I do with this unbearable lack and this inadequacy that I feel? Do I suffer because of them? I unconsciously project this accursed share in me on the other, this racial or religious other that my fantasy has constructed and that my culture provides, ready-made. This racial imaginary gives me an easy answer, a one-size-fits-all reason for my lack and suffering. Racism is a fantasy attempt to cover up my lack, or one's lack, to become a subject without a lack, as if it was possible. Trying to capture an illusory, deluded sense of positive existence, I project my internal negativity onto the figure of the other, this negativity which fundamentally constitutes us as subjects, might we like it or not, something all religions knew intuitively. I throw my own sense of abjection, inadequacy, my suffering onto the racial, religious other. Mistaking the tree for the forest, I make it responsible for my unbearable suffering because it seems to me it enjoys too much, or at least more than I do, or it wants to steal or destroy my precious enjoyment, the American way of life, French culture and language, or it wants to build a mosque in my pristine mountain little town, like in Switzerland. Remember that capitalism requires commands enjoyment. This other who enjoys in a way which disgusts me, trouble me, or are too close to me. In our postmodernity, it seems that the only way not to be lost, dissolved in the universal field of global consumerist, individualist society is to forcefully stick to one's private, peculiar form of enjoyment. The danger there, of course, is to be swallowed by racial paranoia and its fantasy. Instead of attacking a system creating social and economic global inequalities, injustice, and uncertainties for many, all over, I choose an easy target, the racial or sexual other, because I do not know better. I let him, her have it, and I feel so much better after. What a relief, it's cathartic. I finally feel like I'm someone and that I've accomplished something. I'm not the bottom of the heap any longer. I'm a man, a normal American, a true Anglo, a French-speaking normal white man, a white Brit à la James Bond. Socio-political causes to postmodern terrorism. To make things worse, there are attenuating circumstances to my hatred. Reasons which do not let society, we the normal people, off the hook. Somehow we're all guilty because we, the 99 percentile of society, have passively led the top 1% of society controlling our pain, a system where reigns supreme. 1. Extreme poverty. The majority of ISIL terrorists or white supremacist neo-Nazi come from ghettos with dysfunctional, dislocated or non-existent families, banlieue, French suburbs, the contrary of American suburbs, or zones of exclusion with high unemployment and marginalization where young men turning around like trapped animals in cages with no hope of escape. 2. Lack of transcendence and spiritual emptiness. What does the West has to offer its youth besides the daily grind, low wages or high sometimes meaningless jobs, the vacuum of commercial sports and consumption, not to forget Facebook and pornography? What type of spiritual experience or transcendent hope and ascension are there? This void comes as a malaise and anxieties affecting the whole world. 3. Individualism was split by racism, nomadism, ignorance, cultural and routing, what Deleuze called deterritorialization, produces a quasi-schizophrenic behavior in many people. These 3 main points summarize the existence without representation of the Boston bombers, the Chechen Tsarnaev brothers, and the Paris terrorists, the Kouachi brothers, and Amédi Koulibaly. Last point. Why fundamentalist Islam is the answer for terrorism. In the past, communism and its utopia, via the ex-USSR, channeled popular discontentment. Now it's all over. Capitalism has won, or so it seems. So where does this discontentment and anxiety now go? Especially when capitalism claims all over the world that there are no other systems than what it force-feeds us. Remember the slogan, Coke is it? Capitalism is it, baby. Sex, money, jobs, freedom, happiness, high-tech toys, no wealth outside our model of economy or society. What happens when a system becomes total hegemonic and forcefully persuades everybody that there are no other truths? Guess. Violent reaction and refusal, of course. And guess which strong system of beliefs are left in the world to dare challenge Western capitalism? Fundamentalist Islam is one of them. The very thing that we, in the West, paint as irrational, barbarian, medieval, fanatic evil. Well, this fundamentalist Islamist is precisely the Kantian revenge of a radical evil which we have directly or indirectly nurtured. The chicken came home to roost. Or to put it Lacanese, we got our own message back, but inverted, because it came back from our own unconscious. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Jeannette Rankin. He is a professor of Middle Eastern, North Africa, and Central Asian history at the University of Montana and director of the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center at the University of Montana. My dear friend and colleague, Jeannette.
Thank you very much to John Marks, my very dear friend and colleague. Thank you, Hellgate High School, for hosting us. Thank you all for joining us. Everything that I wanted to say has already been said, and therefore I don't have much to say, but to waste your time for the next 7 minutes. I am the token historian in this panel, and usually the task of a historian is to be the most depressing and give you a little bit of notion of the reality out there, as at least I see it. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11, I could not help but notice one fundamental reaction and one fundamental question. The fundamental question was, why do they hate us? That was the fundamental question. The fundamental response was quite disturbing. The fundamental response the day after the attacks was everybody lining up in their bookstores and going and buying a copy of the Holy Book of Islam, the Quran. And as people were buying the copies of the Quran, one brave reporter finally asked that unavoidable question, why are you going into the bookstore? We are buying. What are you buying? A copy of the Quran. Why are you buying a copy of the Quran? Because we want to find out why they hate us. It's one of those moments in your life, driving on Higgins, and you're so shocked by what you just heard that you just pull the car and you wait and try to sort of digest what you just heard. A book which came out 1,400 years will have any reference to United States, really? That's the level of our understanding of Islam. And a book which mentions only two groups outside the Arabian Peninsula, the Greeks and the Persians, and only mentions one woman whose name is Mary, the mother of Jesus, will have a commandment somewhere in it which says attack New York and Washington, D.C. on September 2001. Really? That's where we are educationally and culturally. So that shows where we are in terms of understanding this religion and civilization. But let me move into some suggestions, at least. One suggestion in order to understand the phenomenon of this militant Islam or fundamentalist Islam is to separate Islam as a religion and civilization from political Islam, which is simply an ideology. These are two separate things. Islam is a religion of 1.5 billion people. They live pretty much the ordinary life of everyone else. They are not involved in using Islam in order to attack, mobilize, and carry out terrorist onslaught on innocent people. Political Islam uses Islam, but it's a political ideology of mass mobilization. And political Islam is an ideology which is basically anti-colonial and which is basically anti-nativist or local regimes. The political Islamists, if I may use that, have two enemies, and this is the second point. They have far enemy, they have near enemy. The near enemy are the local regimes, are everyone who opposes them, everyone who may create an obstacle to their expansion. Today, in front of our grieving eyes, we saw 20 innocent human beings killed in Tunisia. What is the purpose of attacking innocent human beings in Tunisia? But to hurt the Tunisian economy, to destroy the Tunisian tourist industry. Why do they attack Tunis? It's because they want to hurt an Arab government, the only Arab government coming from the Arab Spring, which is showing the signs of a democratic system of government. They hate democracy, they hate transparency, they hate equality of men and women, they hate the concept of human rights. They live in the 7th century AD, and they want to recreate the so-called original Islamic State back in 2000, now in 2015. These folks are in a crusade to establish a proto-fascist Islamic State, and let me sort of stand a little bit in a little bit of a distance from other presenters. And my conclusion is sometimes in history, you have to stand up to such people, and there is no other solution to such attacks and to such terrorism but counter-violence, which means the only way to stop ISIS, the only way to stop Al-Qaeda, the only way to stop Jabhat al-Nusra, the other groups that are perpetuating terrorism, is to smash them, is to crush them, is to defeat them. As the Prime Minister of Tunisia said today, you have to eliminate them. They are a threat to the existence of Islamic civilization. They are a threat to the existence of human civilization. They are a threat to the civility and culture of the entire human race. Having said all this, though, before we feel as the principal victims of terrorism, let me also break out two news. One, the principal victims of this terrorism, this so-called militant Islamic terrorism, are not the Westerners. It is the Muslims who have been the principal victims of this massive terrorist attack on their societies. In Tunisia today, yesterday in Iraq, day before in Syria, we have had over and over tens, hundreds, thousands of Muslims who have been killed at the hands of these murderers. But two, what is our role in all this? Are we simply the victims? Can we get off of it so easily? You know, when I saw the ISIS fighters in Iraq and Syria, and I saw what beautiful cars they are driving, what amazing weapons and spare parts they have at their disposal, what kind of organization they carry with them, I have to ask the question, where is the money coming from? A bunch of fascist thugs who claim to be Muslims cannot bring this kind of financial and economic power. When you look at the origins of ISIS, it all traces back to the capitals of the Middle East, and somehow, some ways, it comes back to the United States of America. I'm sorry to report on that. Much of the money for ISIS originally came from Saudi Arabia. Much of the money for ISIS came from Kuwait. Much of the money for arming and organizing the ISIS came from United Arab Emirates, or Qatar, or other oil-exporting countries. Who buys the oil? Who buys the cheap oil? Who is addicted to the cheap Arab oil from the Persian Gulf region? But United States. And let us go 1 minute even back and ask yourself, another terrorist group, Taliban, which housed the Al-Qaeda, who organized the Mujahideen in Afghanistan back in 1980s to fight the Soviet Red Army, but the CIA, but the Pakistani military intelligence, but the Saudi military intelligence. You know, that person that we killed, Osama bin Laden, was an ally of the United States, was an ally of Pakistani military intelligence, was an ally of the Saudi military intelligence. Osama bin Laden was a Saudi national whose activities was well known to the United States of America. Taliban, bin Laden, Al-Qaeda have been growing under our nose, and we ignored it for so many years because they were fighting and killing the Russians for 10 years, and we could care less. It is about time, therefore, to wake up. And instead of looking at the world as this simplistic us versus them, good versus evil, Christians versus Muslims, and so on and so forth, look at the trail of money, look at the trail of where all these organizations come from, and ask yourself the fundamental question, why, after knowing all these facts, and I'm sure Washington, D.C. is very well aware of these facts, why is Saudi Arabia still the closest ally of the United States? Thank you very much.
Next, may the house lights up a little bit, please. Thank you. Next, we'd like to move into having you ask questions. We've got 2 mics set up on either side here, and if you would come up to either one, and we'll kind of alternate. First, I'd like you to please state your name when you step up to the mic, and please refrain from any long statements. We'd like to have questions for our panelists, please, that they can answer. And again, I'd like to remind you that please remember this is a discussion tonight. We want to have a civil dialogue and a discourse of a topic that we may have very different views on. Please listen, respond appropriately. So, all right, we have microphone on right over here. We'll start on this side. If you have someone you want to address your question to, please do that.
So, whoa, that's loud. So you spoke of I'm trying to word it properly so I don't offend anyone, but the God of the Bible is worshipped by Christians and Islam. The same God of the Bible. They have the same God. Islam and not Christians, but Hebrews. They have the same God. So that's my question. They worship the same God. The Hebrews, the Jewish culture, and Islam. They have the same God. So why, that's my question, why, when we're speaking of terrorism and we're speaking of the Taliban and we speak of ISIS, they all worship the same God, which is the same God of Christianity, if you believe in Jesus. Isn't it all the same God?
So I'm going to take this question as an anthropologist, because a friend of mine, Carol Delaney, an anthropologist, has written a beautiful book about the Abrahamic traditions.
Correct.
And based on ethnography in Turkey, to talk about the historical and cultural roots in many parts of the world in which these three religions do have common heritage. And that is important to remember in studying them and drawing from these different faiths and traditions their historical and their ethical wisdom. But I think several of the panelists have pointed out that religion and political Islam, political ideologies are two different things. And on the one hand, you can take their statements about their own faith, but you have to remember that so much of it is manipulated, as Meredith pointed out, as a political ideology. And it is not representative of anyone's faith, because what they are presenting is a political, cynical, very unethical presentation that has subverted, as Samir said, and really miscast an entire tradition of 1.4 billion people. This is why education is so important, to be able to distinguish between on the one hand, the historical common roots of religions, and on the other, the kind of cynical political ideologies.
Right, but the question is, if you go a little deeper, like when I was watching the news, and I watch all, not just NPR, but I listened, and I watched all the news, and when I saw the people of France running for their lives in the streets, and you see the people that it affects, and not just 9/11, but in France and all around the world. It's not just Islam, and it's not just ISIS, and it's not just the Taliban, and it's not just, you can keep on going and going and going. And my thought is, when I see the people running for their lives on the streets of France and Paris, and they're screaming and yelling, and the towers are coming down in New York City, what does that mean? And whoever said they spoke about fear, isn't it all about fear when it comes down to it? It's fear. Isn't it all fear-based?
Let me make one more response from New York, because I just a week ago stood with the students at Ground Zero, and if you go there today, you see a remarkable new memorial in which there are more people, different people from different countries, all there to see, to honor, to remember, to overcome fear, and it was the most amazing sight to me to see.
Then why isn't
Let me finish. to see the response that has been accomplished, not just by the United States, but an open square where people from all over the world were walking. We saw tourists from every country there around that memorial. And I think that is a testament to not just us here, but all of us, as Lori said, all of us.
So, great question. I think one of the problems, first of all, they are not Islams, they are Muslims. That's the proper name for the followers of Islam. Islam is the name of the religion. Those who follow the religion are Muslims, not Islams.
So the media will say it's Islam.
Let me finish, please. Secondly, and this is very important, I think your question has your answer. I think you have watched too much TV. And one of the problems, I think we are in a high school. I think we need to read. I think we do need to read and study and travel and interact and learn and eat other people's foods and travel to other cultures and grow up from an isolation which sometimes the media would like to perpetuate. The media concentrated for almost 2.5 weeks on the tragic death of the French journalist in Charlie Hebdo. I cried personally. I was shocked. Charlie Hebdo was the favorite newspaper. This cannot be in any sense justified under any religion, under any ideology. It was barbaric. But I want to ask you a question. How many times did you see any heads or any limbs shattered in Iraq war? After 10 years, 600,000 Iraqis were killed. And I can ask you to show me one clip of boys and girls, mothers and fathers, homes and businesses destroyed as a result of this war. I'm not even talking about Afghanistan and several 100,000 people in Afghanistan. I'm not even talking about other zones of conflict and warfare. This is not to say that they are justified, but this is to say that violence has not been all one-sided either. And the terrorists always look at the thing and they justify their actions based on opportunistically and conveniently, of course, by using the violence that the native population has suffered. And let me go back a little bit farther, because this violence has been there for 200 years now. None of the countries of North Africa and the Arab Middle East was created by the native population. From 1830, 1830, all these countries were created by a European colonial power. Colonialism is the worst kind of violence. Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Libya, Algeria, Morocco are all artificial states created by one or other European colonial power. This region has been battered, has been violated, has been dominated, humiliated for the last 2 centuries. Again, I'm not using this as a justification to justify these heinous acts. I am suggesting that after 200 years, after 2 major wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, you unavoidably create a pool of resentment, anger, and rage, which is manipulated by the fascist Islamists. You cannot expect any other reality. And in terms of violence, you know, the folks here are much better in religious issues. But I have to teach medieval Islam. And part of medieval Islam is to talk about the first major encounter between Christendom and Islam. And part of that encounter are the Crusades coming from Europe to the Islamic world. On the way to Jerusalem, committing cannibalism, massacring the entire Jewish population in Jerusalem, massacring a large portion of the Muslim population in Jerusalem. Look, if we go down to whose religion is less violent, or every side can bring you a chapter of the other side and say, you were more violent than I was. Again, this doesn't justify this, but I am suggesting that the solution is not to go and attack Islam as a religion. Is actually bring Muslims to our side and work with them to isolate the minority terrorists.
Please again, if you identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Kelsey, and this might be a question for Lori Franklin or Professor Kia or Professor Bitar. So I am a Reformed Jewish woman. Lori is actually my rabbi, and I currently live with a Muslim family that I consider my family, basically, and my best friend Raneem is here with me at this lecture. And I think my question is just how do we promote this and promote being like welcome with each other and loving each other and having that open dialogue? In this, I don't know how to word it exactly, but I think I have a fear, you know, as a human being, as a Jewish woman, that I just want to go out and hug everyone and say it's okay, and I am not a hateful person, but I have a fear that other people won't react that way. So I'm just wondering how we go about that, particularly for people of those faiths.
I'll start. I think one of the things that we have to think about here in town is how are we, are the circles we're walking in a little too tight? Are we always talking to people that we agree with? Are we always visiting with people who don't challenge us? And so when it comes to the university campus, I know that there have been students who come from other countries, especially the countries where Islam is the prevailing or only official religion. And there have been churches here in town that have invited students to have dinners and talk. And what happens is that there's a student turnover, so it has to be a constant effort. You know, it's not something that sustains itself because students come and go. And so the groups that are promoting this kind of dialogue need to have a long-term commitment to keeping it up and kind of keeping the pumped up. I think another thing is that we don't often know how to actually have a discursive conversation, a conversation where we're not trying to win. That has its functions too. Debate is good. But when it comes to getting to know someone else and to trying to understand what makes them tick and what they think, you have to step away from debating whether you're right and they're wrong. You have to begin to adopt a view that I can be right and you can be right. Or maybe we're both wrong. But in any event, you have to listen with a different kind of ear. And we don't have much practice doing that in our daily routines and institutions. Discursive listening, not trying to make a point, not engaging in polemic, is actually pretty tough. And there are exercises for learning how to do this, and the reward is great. And one of my experiences here in town is one of the wonderful things in my life, personal life, is some of the interfaith organizations that I'm involved with, the Missoula Ministerial Association and the Missoula Interfaith Collaborative. I love being with these folks because all of us care deeply about doing stuff for our communities and for the larger community. And we come from all of these rich traditions. And we get to talk about language. Like when you say God, what do you mean? When you say redemption, revelation, what are you talking about? What are you talking about when you use the word creation? And we find that a lot of our, even using the same words, are loaded different ways. And beginning to appreciate that, and beginning to appreciate how we develop the philosophies that we live by is very, very valuable. Someone else want to speak?
Thank you for your question. I believe everything starts with attitude, okay? And with the right attitude, we can resolve any issue. That's how one would start anything. I share a lot of acronyms with my students, and this comes from AAE. The first A is attitude, and some people need to triple up on their first A. The second A is attendance, and that doesn't mean just showing up. That means being ready to engage, having done your homework, have read, have educated yourself on the subject. And the last one, E, is for effort. And if you do AAE, I assure you you will succeed in any endeavor you undertake in your life. The next thing that would shed light on your question is to learn about compassion. Now, to some extent, our ability to show compassion is dependent upon our being in a better state than others ourselves, and I believe we are. But at the same time, it is also dependent upon our ability to feel the common humanity of ourselves and others. To be a compassionate person towards others, we must be able to put ourselves in their place. That is definitely imperative. You have to be able to put yourself in the other person's place in order to be compassionate. And most of all, acknowledging that we are like them and make an effort to understand. We are all one large family. We belong to the human race, and I believe we have the skills and ability to discuss as we are and move forward in a positive ways. I always share with everyone, if you want to know and understand how an American Muslim feels, I suggest all the females wear a hijab for one day and walk around Missoula. There is several already videos on YouTube that show American females doing that. I suggest the same thing for the males. Put on Muslim attire and walk. See the pressure in the tents and the stairs, and sometimes not very kind words. So you have to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes. You have to be able to imagine what it's like for them and realize that we are all human and we all seek the same things in life.
May I add something very quickly? Your question is very difficult. I'll be very careful not to go into speaking. Of course, discussion is important. That's why we are here. But to love the other, there's a good book you may read on Levinas. It's not that easy. It's not, oh, be compassionate, love your neighbor, and everything is dandy. No. Because you have the unconscious, you have fantasy. And religion knew that. It boils down to that. What you do with your alienation, your suffering, your trauma. It's not something you can just discharge by being a goodwill person to people, by the way, who looks like you, who enjoy like you. It's easy to be, I'm not putting everybody down, it's easy to be compassionate in Missoula. There's no fractures, or there are fractures between the poor and the non-poor, or the Indian population. But it's not there in your face like in Los Angeles, in the barrios. So what you do with, then you have to go in the unconscious. The terrorists use God also as a reference. You may question it may be hypocritical, although I'm not sure. There is an adherence there coming from the unconscious where fantasy is involved. This is very difficult to deal with. It's not only a question of goodwill. Of course, you have to have goodwill, but it's not enough. That's what I'm pessimistic about. And if I blueprint, I will give it to you. One cannot ask everybody to go through psychoanalysis and see where special enjoyment is, where it's projected in certain negative way or the other. But this is very difficult.
So in order to show compassion or to interact, we have to know who we are interacting with. And one of the issues, at least with the so-called Muslim community that I see, is that there are these very simplistic notions about what this is, what this Muslim community is. First and foremost, in the minds of the overwhelming majority of Americans, Muslims are Arabs. I mean, Islam is equivalent to Arabs. And nothing could be farther from truth than that. There are 57 Islamic countries or countries with majority. The overwhelming majority of them are not Arabs. Arabs are those who speak Arabic. That's how we define Arabs. It has nothing to do with their religion. There are anywhere between 10 to 14 million Christian Arabs who go to church on Sunday. We never think about Christianity and Arabs. I was standing in the middle of Jerusalem, you know. Here is, you know, the most important church in the entire Christianity, and who's going to church? Arabic-speaking people, right? We never see them. And what is the population of Arabs in comparison to the population of the entire Islamic world? Samir can help me, 350 million? 300 million approximately Arabs in the world. The population of the Islamic world is 1.5 billion. Do your math, and you realize that Islam is not equivalent to the Arab world. And the largest Islamic country in the world is Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, with its own very rich and incredibly diverse culture. Gigi can help us, she's the expert. And then comes Bangladesh, which is still not even in the Middle East. And then come Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, the Muslims in Central Asia, the Muslims in non-North African part, then Muslims in the United States, Europe, Muslims in Russia and China, right? And we constantly, when we talk about Islam, it's as if it's Saudi Arabia. That's an insult, right? To Muslims everywhere. Oh, you're a Muslim, you must be an Arab. No, I'm not an Arab. I respect the Arabs. I have many Arab friends. And the Arabs have always contributed to the richness of human civilization and the Islamic culture. And the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, was an Arab because he spoke Arabic, and his holy book, the Quran, was revealed in Arabic. But look, I've been in many countries, Turkey, Iran. They're looking at the prayers on the wall, and they don't have any idea what they say because they don't speak Arabic, right? And many of them recite the prayers without understanding the meaning of it. Unless we understand the incredible diversity of the Islamic world, the richness of its civilizations and cultures, and avoid this constantly homogenizing them, right? Into one group, Arabs, terrorists, towelheads running around in the desert. Which brings me to the notion, why do we do this? Why do we take such a complex reality and oversimplify it, reduce it to few adjectives? One is ignorance, and some of this ignorance is intentional. Some of it is historical, and some of it is also media-driven because they love to have good versus bad, you know, conflict zones, Palestinians versus Israelis, and so on and so forth. But the other one is, if you dehumanize the people, bombing them is much easier.
Thank you all.
We have a question over here.
I wrote down my question. My name is Ari. I had a question about our role as citizens, civilians, and activists, knowing that our country has had a direct role in terrorism in other countries, that our country has created executed 9/11s every day in other countries based on kind of flimsy intelligence. And I think that as a civilian and someone who tries to do solidarity work, I am getting sort of more disillusioned about war and about this country, and kind of getting a better understanding of U.S. history, and like understanding that the U.S., if you kind of look at the patterns that have happened, that the U.S. will seemingly be perpetually at war in order to maintain its status as a world power. So I guess I'm wondering about what our role is as civilians who don't hear about the violence our country causes until we see it coming back to us in the form of 9/11 type violence that we can respond to with our kind of limited information and limited understanding. And I guess I'm wondering if, on top of what is our role, like, are we expected to expect this cycle to continue as, you know, as the generation goes on?
I'm going to turn away from the last question, but to the first question of what can we do as civilians, as students, as citizens. I think you're doing it right now. We all came out tonight to learn, to educate ourselves, and I try to do that every day. This morning on the radio, they had a story of a woman who works in immigration. And when she was a 4th grader, she heard about 4 women killed in El Salvador. It was a very famous case of 4 nuns and missionaries who were murdered. And their murders were really catalytic to the whole kind of work that Americans did to try to bring peace in Latin America throughout the 1980s, which was a very violent decade. Margaret was part of that violence, funding it and encouraging a lot of acts. So she was motivated by that memory to go and work in immigration in the United States government. And today, she is working to deport those people who have been found guilty of human rights abuses and to bring these cases to justice. A wonderful word to work for, right? An ethical concept of justice. And I was so inspired to hear, you know, this is an American who believes in her job, who goes to work every day to work for justice. So you find those commitments in your life, and if you can educate yourself about, it's very depressing to learn about these violences, but if you can look at them and then find your place to do your work to try to bring justice, I think all of us try to do that in our lives.
So I would just add to that, what I see students at the university more and more doing is going abroad for their own education. So I have students that come back that have spent time in Jerusalem or in any part of a place that has conflict, and when they come back, it's a different story. I know those, I was at that place. That's my friend. And, you know, the word compassion, the root word of compassion is womb, to know the other as if they're in your womb. That to know them that like they are your relation. And you spoke of, you know, we're all family. If we go back far enough, we are all family. We're all cousins, right? But it takes work. What can we do in Missoula? Education and travel, but then to grow that family, to get to know each other, to build those relationships. I think that matters. I think if that happens all over the country, that changes our politics as a nation. What do we do here? We can do our part to be a different way and not be people of fear and hatred, but people of sisters and brothers and cousins that care for each other no matter what.
Politically also, it's look at the budget of the Pentagon. It's the largest military budget in the world. And of course, there's always argument from the Hawks and the Homeland Defense, but I think politically, the first target will be the Pentagon and this militarization of the whole world according to American paradigms. So that's the political resistance.
I'd like to thank you for your question, and I'm going to divide it into two venues. We as Americans, as I mentioned in my introductory speech, can create a just society. We can. We Americans can do that. Now we have to have a role within the U.S. internally, and then we have a role with our foreign affairs. We live in a democracy, and I'd like to share with all my fellow Americans that democracy is an activity. If you don't participate, it doesn't work. So look at the number of people who vote in our elections. How many people are actually active? I sincerely believe that it is the moral obligation of every literate member of a society to be active, to provide service, to be part and parcel. After all, it's a government for the people of the people. And in America, those who show up run the show. So, you are showing up tonight, that is beautiful. That's what we need to do. We need to exercise our critical thinking. I've been in the US 40 years now. I'm very disheartened on a daily basis that Islamophobia is okay. Bad-mouthing Muslims is okay in America. I think we're all Americans and we agree that bad-mouthing any group is not acceptable. You know, what happens in a society is basically what a society allows. So we are all part and parcel of it. We should all be able to participate and voice our opinions. My grandfather, God bless his soul, told me, Samir, make sure you speak your mind with dedication. If you don't say your views, they will not be considered. So, we have to speak up. Speak up within our circles, with our friends, with our family, with our extended network, with our community. We need to stand up and speak as the Americans we are. You know, when you observe the powerful oppressing the powerless, and you wash your hands from it, let me tell you, you are siding with the powerful. And at that juncture in time, you are no longer neutral. And all this is being done in our name. We can rise to it. We can affect whatever happens in our society, and we can elect whoever we want in office to fix our foreign policy and create harmony across the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I have a question over here, I believe.
Hello, my name is Kaylee. My question really relates to the last question. Oftentimes when we try and confront someone on an individual level and say, you are perpetuating false stereotypes, and ask them to open up to discussion, the natural response is for someone else to get defensive, to start arguing. So I was wondering how we as individuals can deal with that, can deal with people who become defensive, and help them to understand all the factors around them when they don't want to see it and they don't want to believe what's actually going on.
I just have one sentence for that. With love, we can reach the highest in human existence. So I can share with you the next acronym I share with my students. Four is hard to follow. 4 L's. We live, we learn, we laugh, and most of all, we love.
So I'm going to share an anecdote from New York again, because it's been such an inspiring place for me, and also one from Indonesia. In Indonesia, when I lived there in the 1980s, I didn't have much access to any news. And there was one moment where a family was gathering and one of the uncles came to me and said, "Why don't you pick on someone your own size?" And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, your president, he just bombed Libya. Why don't you pick on someone your own size?" And I was just shocked, and because I hadn't heard about the event, and at the time, I realized that for them, here they were hosting an American student, right? They had opened their arms to me, they had shared their lives with me, but they felt betrayed because my country was bombing another country that they identified with in the 1980s. And so I had a really difficult time trying to figure out how to respond because I'm not my country, right? I'm an American citizen living in Indonesia, but how do I respond to that? And at the time I realized you can't always respond when somebody's defensive. You just have to let them work that out. You have to be clear in your own mind what your response is, but you can't always help somebody get over a fear because that fear is really deep, and as Michelle said, it can be sometimes very irrational. And so you want to just try to let them solve their own fear and maybe model for them some kind of strength that comes from realizing that your own limits, your own ability to resolve it. So the anecdote in New York was we were on a cruise in the harbor listening to music that was way too loud. You know, like the DJ had really cranked it up and we were all really tired and you know, huge music and everything. So I went to the DJ and I said, you know, we'd really appreciate it if you could just lower the volume a little bit because these folks are really, you know, it's late. And so he said, absolutely. Of course, you know, I was really pounding hip hop and he did. He immediately just turned it right down and everybody was like, oh, thank you so much. And I realized afterwards, you know, people feel uncomfortable in a situation that they don't know. You know, they might not like that music. They feel kind of, it's New York, you know, it's all kind of different and everything. Just turning down that volume allowed everyone to feel the love. And afterwards the DJ said, I want to send out the love to high school bands, Hellgate, to El Cerrito, to all these kids, because he too felt the love for people. But, you know, it's really difficult sometimes to get around that defensiveness we feel between different communities and different kinds of music in different places. And I would just offer those two.
I'd like to add something. Sometimes when you're talking to someone and they become defensive, one technique is just to ask them to tell you more about how they arrived at their view. You don't have to convince them of your viewpoint. You just hear their stories. You know, what are the things that they know about in their experience that leads them to see what they see things the way they see it? You could get into some pretty interesting conversations that way and actually learn something about the history of that person. And it's wonderful to be asked a question because then you have a chance to talk and then that builds a relationship. You're listening to their stories. And then maybe you can tell a story of your own. And then, you have a conversation, a real conversation, instead of an argument.
I would just add that that kind of work is hard. Peacemaking is hard. It's stressful. You engage yourself in conflict. Most of us don't like it. It's easier just to walk the other way, but then you're part of the problem. And you know, that story of Jesus going across to the other side, you know, he took a whole boatload, probably for a good reason. You know, who are your people that you can ground yourself in? Is there a faith tradition that you can ground yourself in? I think being grounded in this work is really important. In people, community, support. You know, you write a letter to the editor in the Missouri, and if it's close to anything we're talking about, you're going to get hate mail, and you have to be ready for that. And you still write the letter because it needs to be written, but that will come, and then you keep going.
Thank you, Shukran.
I think that to answer your question or to respond with a comment, the reality is that we all live in our own cultural identity prisons. And it is extremely difficult to get out of it. And though we are sitting here with a very enlightened and educated audience and look at each other and say we have to put ourselves in other people's shoes. In my case, I couldn't do that unless I was hit myself with a demand to do it. We had just returned from Iran, watching the revolution unfold. And by we, I mean myself and my distinguished brother, Dr. Ardikia. And we had seen the society being hijacked by a demagogue whose name is Ayatollah Khomeini and will go down in history as a fascist butcher. And we came to this country and something happened which is called the hostage crisis. Those who are young among you do not remember it, but those of you who remember November 1979 remember that a group of students, calling themselves students following the path of Imam Khomeini, had seized the embassy and was holding 50-some Americans as hostage. And here we are in the most enlightened center of education in Midwest, Madison, Wisconsin, the Berkeley of the Midwest, the red town, as if everyone is a commie. Here comes an Iranian woman trying to go to her class. The elevator opens, and there's a huge slogan in the elevator, "Rape an Iranian woman today." And a few nights later, we are coming back from the library, and we are surrounded by a group of motorcyclists with chains and knives coming to us. And, "Hey, Arabs, go back where you have come from." And at that point, you cannot say, "Hold on. First of all, you're really ignorant. It's Arabs, it's not Arabs. Secondly, I'm not an Arab. Third, please attend a few more classes and read." And of course, it is after these events, basically, that, and I don't know how these work, but I think then you are shaken from your existential comfort zone, and you're forced to respond. And my response was to educate myself and to educate others. That's the best way I know how to respond.
Okay, my name is Keith, and first, just a little preface question to make sure that my other question makes sense. Would you say that the American people as a whole are ignorant about this topic? Just yes or no? I would say that it's become clear that they're pretty ignorant. I just want to make sure that I'm correct in that assumption. Yes.
Ignorance is a relative term. So, different levels of ignorance, and Americans are not unique. I tell you, there are every society has a lot of ignorance in them. So, this is not picking on America.
Okay, thank you.
One more thing.
Yes.
It's not just ignorance, it's ignorance and the illusion of knowledge. That's what we have in the US.
Okay, that actually works perfect, because my question is, for that ignorance, what's the greatest factor that's contributing to that ignorance? Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. But what's the greatest factor that's contributing to this ignorance or this knowledge that we think we have that's not actually knowledge, that's misinformation? Is it the media? Is it our inability to relate to people who are different, who are the others? What's the greatest factor?
Thank you for saying that. I have to jump back very fast. Look at the status of foreign languages in the US. I think that's the first factor. Media, of course, enormous. It's another ball game. But the language, there's a retreat in America of instead of foreign language. You cannot, understand the other through global leadership. You have to go through languages, which is hard. Learning the culture, the language, the way of thinking, getting out of oneself. That's the main road. And how many language courses are there in Arab or in German? It's being retreating in French, in Russian, I heard, even in Chinese locally. I mean, language are on the retreat. If you don't have any language, you cannot even make a gesture outside of yourself.
I would just add to that as well. I truly love our country, but part of our problem is conceit. If we believe we're just the greatest country and the most powerful country in the world, we don't really have to care about others. And I would say that as for North American Christians, that often rings true as well. And we were at a panel a few years back, and a Muslim student said, Muslims believe that Jesus was a prophet and Moses was a prophet. What do Christians think of Muhammad? And I had to, say, most Christians don't think of Muhammad. We mostly don't give Muhammad a lot of credit. We don't. There's a conceit there that permeates. That's why we don't have to learn other languages, and it's gotten us in a lot of trouble. We don't have to take the other seriously. We don't have to respect the other. We don't have to imagine that the other has a sense of truth. That we don't come to it with a sense of humility, and that has got us into a whole lot of trouble.
Of course, there are several factors, many factors. I'll share something about the media. Okay? And I have a question for all my fellow Americans. We always say, they have government-controlled media. My question is, if we had government-controlled media, how would it be different than what we have now? That question is for all of you. I don't need an answer. I had many speaking engagements after 9/11. In fact, I had about 12 of them between September and the end of the year. I'll share with you what I said back in 2003, or the dates are getting scrambled now. I would like to assure all my fellow citizens that what transpired on September 11th in New York was a perversion of Islam, and not a reflection of Islam. After watching countless hours of media coverage of the September 11th attacks and the US reaction, I have many qualms with our media. Journalists seem to prefer to publish or air images of people who look different. Arab Americans say that reporters stay away unless there is a problem to report, or if there is a national or international crisis for which they want an action. This keeps people like Arab Americans and other minority groups out of sight, except when they are associated with trouble. The solution is to cover Arab Americans and other minority groups consistently and constantly, not just bring them to the media and the American populace when there is trouble, okay? It's like I'm a teacher. If you walk into my class and I tell you, do you know Socrates? He was very bad to his wife. He was ugly, short. And I tell you this, every day you come, like our media tells us every day. And then a couple of months later, you run into another and go, I took this class, Socrates. You go, yeah, I know him. He's short, ugly, argumentative, bad to his wife. So the media really has a lot to do with this, definitely. In the words of Noam Chomsky, any dictator would love the obedience of the American media. You know, the media uses the term Islamic fundamentalist. Well, this is largely an American construct that has been used to imply political conservatism and sometimes extremism. The use of this term to refer to people who use Islam to justify political actions has blurred the distinction between religion and politics. Because of this, acts carried out for political reasons are attributed to religion. You know, I learned to be American. I'm Palestinian by birth and experience. I'm American by naturalization and experience. Most of all, I'm Montanan by residence and experience. And I know that this is not the American way. You know, fairness and accuracy is the American way, which means attributing political actions to the group, movement, or party responsible, not to a religion or a race. You know, the response of the US to September 11 in the press and media has troubled me a lot. Even the way they cover the 3 shootings in North Carolina. If you compare the vocabulary they use, you know, media is constructed. TV isn't called programming for no particular reason. It is to program the masses. So you have to be really diligent and triangulate and get many sources. I thought, you know, when I first came to America 40 years ago, that journalists are to keep the government honest. Our journalists, I'm sorry to say, are a mouthpiece for the government. And I only touched on one factor, the media. We can talk about many other factors, but we don't have the time tonight. Thank you.
I wrote down your question because I don't know that I can answer it now, but I'm going to think about it because I want to go back to the 1950s and give credit to an era in which America was perceived by the world very differently. If you talk to people from other parts of the world about how they think of America, you know, they remember a time when America was a real positive force in the world. And part of that era that was so important to education was the Fulbright commitment to creating programs to teach foreign languages, lesser taught languages they call them, but they're really the world languages, the languages of the world civilizations. And this, you know, Hellgate is a very unusual place because we have 6 foreign languages being taught at this high school, and we're in the process of trying to introduce more world languages at the University of Montana for the same reason. Because there is a place for trying to undo ignorance by learning languages, but it's not just the language, right? It's also the context, the cultural context in which those languages matter. So if we teach Arabic or Hindi or Chinese or Russian or French or German to students in this community, we need to also be able to have that context in which the use of that language, the beauty and the love of that language flourishes. And I think we could learn a lot about how to go back to that moment in the 1950s when the United States felt it was important for every one of its citizens to have the opportunity to study world languages.
Okay, we have time for one more question over here. Is there somebody waiting in line, or do you think there's a gentleman sitting there? Or is there glasses? Are you waiting, sir?
Yes.
Would you please explain?
So one thing I've seen posed in the media at the moment is, sorry, do you want me to stand?
Microphone close to your mouth.
Okay, sorry. So my name is Sam. One thing I've seen posed in the media at the moment is the rise and ultimate dawn of the Islamic Caliphate, specifically among the fundamentalist groups. Do you think this is true, and if it will ultimately come to pass in the near future, and if and how it should be stopped?
So Islamic Caliphate is the ideology that Ben Laden introduced. Caliphate, and we don't have time to go through this in the next 2 minutes. It has a history of over 1400 years. Caliphate was an institution which was created as a form of creating a succession process after Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, died in 632. And the system was based on the community of believers to select candidates, to debate their qualifications, and to choose the best person available to lead the Muslim community, or the Ummah, as it was called, right? And there were 4 righteous caliphs who are recognized by all Muslims as the rightful successors of Muhammad. The last time an Islamic state, an Islamic government tried to use the concept was the Ottoman Empire. After 1774, the Ottoman Sultan, meaning the Ottoman monarch or king, actually added the title of Caliph, which comes from Arabic Khalifa, deputy, right, successor, representative, to his titles in order to claim religious and spiritual supremacy over the entire Islamic world. And why did he do this? Is because the Ottoman Empire was losing left and right to the British, to the French, to the Russians. And the Russians were using Slavic unity, Pan-Slavism, for example. And to counter that, the Ottomans came up with a new ideology called Pan-Islamism. If you claim that all Slavic people should rally under the flag of Imperial Russia, well, all Muslims should rally under the flag of Islam, which means Ottoman Empire. And of course, it's not only Muslims in Russia, but also Muslims in India, Muslims all across the Arab world, North Africa, which would create problems for the French, the British, and the Russians to control the Muslim population. So from the very beginning in its new form, this concept has been politicized and has been used as a counter-ideology to pressure from the West. This concept died with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the formation of the modern Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of Turkey, disbanded Caliphate and sent the last Ottoman Sultan and Caliph into exile, and Turkey emerged as a secular republic, which was founded on separation of religion from state. And everybody thought that it was gone and over with, until a new version of Islam, pumped by a lot of revenue from sale of its oil, began to reintroduce the concept. And that was Saudi Arabia, and it was in the context of Saudi version of Islam that the concept of caliphate was reintroduced in 1970s, and Mr. bin Laden then began to talk about the need to have one Muslim caliph, conveniently probably himself, ruling and leading the Islamic world from the caves in Afghanistan. This notion, therefore, is a politicized version of the original notion, which tells you what I was trying to convey. There is a fundamental difference between the original Islamic concept of communal consensus, having candidates choosing the right candidate for leading the Muslim community, and of course the new politicized version which says, I am the self-proclaimed caliph. And of course once bin Laden was killed, then the job was open for other contenders. And suddenly we have this character with his $15,000 watch, which should not have come out from underneath his sleeve. His name is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, a former prisoner of US forces in Iraq, who is now claiming to be the new caliph or Amir of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. How seriously people in the Islamic world take it, I can assure you that 99.99% of Muslims laugh at this. His followers, of course, the 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, however many it is, they take him very seriously, and they're very dangerous, and they have to be dealt with.
I think we're done. I just want to thank our panel again. We give them a round of applause. NCBI, the National Coalition Building Institute, and Heidi Walsh, her staff, who have been great behind-the-scenes help here today. And Heidi, did you want to have a few words to say?
I'll just use this.
Okay.
Just want to thank the panelists again and for the amazing participation of the audience. And I really loved hearing from the young people as well. It's incredibly inspiring to know that we have so many awesome people in our community. Just as a closing, to be able to leave here today thinking about how we can continue these conversations and continue asking some of the brilliant questions that were posed to our panel today. We want to, create space for continuing dialogue around sometimes controversial issues, but have it be in the compassionate, welcoming, safe space to do so. And we're passing around some clipboards where if you want to be on a mailing list to be invited to more sessions, but also if there are topics, other topics that you would like to discuss as a community, we want to hear those as well. And we heard tonight too often the missing information and the misinformation that exists creates barriers to having those authentic relationships across group lines and have an opportunity to teach and learn from each other so that we can build bridges instead of the barriers that we see today. So thank you again, and thank you to our sponsors and our panelists, and look forward to more opportunities like this.
For that, again, thank you to all of our sponsors, and thank you for all of you coming tonight, and good night to all.